Imagine a world where the very blood that courses through the veins of some of the most notorious figures in American history traces its roots back to unspeakable horrors. A world where power, wealth, and privilege are passed down through generations, but so too are dark secrets, twisted legacies, and a trail of blood-soaked history. These aren't just stories of individuals, they're the stories of bloodlines that have shaped some of the most chilling chapters in America's past. From notorious crime families to hidden connections that tie together the rich and the vile, what happens when the sins of the fathers echo through the lives of their children and their children's children? The ghosts of old money, corruption, and brutality still haunt the corridors of some of America's wealthiest and most powerful families. Are they mere accidents of fate, or do these bloodlines deliberately cultivate their darkness? In the next 4 hours, we're diving deep into the twisted origins of some of the darkest families in America's history. So buckle up, this is not your typical history lesson. This is a journey into the heart of America's most horrifying bloodlines, where no one is quite who they seem, and every twist in the tale leads deeper into the unknown, ready to uncover secrets that will shake you to your core. But before we begin, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with anyone brave enough to face the truth about these chilling families. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. If you're intrigued by what you've just heard, give this video a thumbs up, subscribe for more dark and mysterious stories, and share it with someone who dares to explore the darker side of history. Let's dive in. Chapter 1: The Dark Roots of America's Elite. When we think of America's wealthiest families, the images that come to mind are usually ones of luxury, power, and influence. But what if I told you that these families' fortunes weren't simply a result of hard work or good fortune? What if behind their sprawling estates, perfectly tailored suits, and polished personas there was a much darker truth? These families' roots don't just run deep in wealth, they're tangled in something far more sinister. At the core of America's elite is a bloodline so deeply entangled with corruption, violence, and power struggles that it makes the most infamous crime families seem tame by comparison. The story of these twisted bloodlines begins long before the grandiose mansions, before the power lunches and political influence. Back in a time when America's elite were built not just on wealth, but on the backs of the oppressed, the broken, and the forgotten. How did they build such wealth? How did these families, some of the richest in the world, begin? The answer lies not in their business savvy, but in darker forces, the violence, betrayal, and manipulation that formed the foundations of their power. Think about it, the richest families didn't become powerful just by chance. It wasn't simply a series of lucky breaks or a few shrewd business deals. The roots of their wealth lie in something far more sinister, hidden acts of cruelty, domination, and secrecy. Behind every mansion and boardroom, there's a legacy of twisted ambition and unspoken horrors. Ever wonder where the first spark of wealth and power came from? It's not just about hard work, it's about who was trampled along the way. As we look deeper into these families, the timeline begins to reveal a startling pattern. The very first generations of these bloodlines, the ones who set the stage for their descendants' opulence, didn't just gain wealth, they acquired it through ruthless methods. Take the colonial era, for example. While America was just beginning to form, the wealthiest families of the time were often involved in exploitative practices. Some of the most notable names in the early days of the nation were deeply involved in the transatlantic slave trade. Others made their fortunes through the seizure of land from Native Americans, creating an iron-fisted hold on the land that would eventually form the backbone of America's economy. Behind every fortune, there was a story of bloodshed, whether it was the blood of enslaved people working the fields of sprawling plantations, or the blood of indigenous people driven from their ancestral lands. But these are the origins of wealth that, for generations, would be passed down, covered in a veil of respectability. No one told the full story. It was a tale of survival for the privileged and destruction for those beneath them. Now consider the families that began to rise to the top during this time, names you likely recognize today. These families, many of whom have become synonymous with America's political and business elite, were not only wealthy, they were dangerous. Their power was not just about money, but about controlling others and manipulating systems. It wasn't just about building empires, it was about making sure that no one would ever threaten their empire's foundation. In a way, they were playing a game with the lives of others, a game where the stakes were nothing short of life and death. As the centuries rolled on, these bloodlines continued to evolve, but the undercurrents of violence and manipulation never went away. Instead, they became more refined, more hidden behind the veil of high society. The wealth was passed down, and with it, the legacy of power. These families weren't just holding on to their money, they were expanding it, spreading their influence further and further into the fabric of American life. As industrialization took hold, some of the wealthiest families turned their attention to industries like oil, railroads, and steel. Names like Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, and Carnegie became emblematic of this new wave of American industry. But what most people don't realize is how much of their power came from less than ethical means. In the late 1800s, John D. Rockefeller, for example, wasn't just building an oil empire. He was creating monopolies that crushed competition and bent laws to his will. But Rockefeller wasn't the only one. All throughout the country, families like the Morgans and the Astors were weaving their webs of influence, tying together political, economic, and cultural power in ways that most of us could never fully comprehend. These families used their influence to shape everything from the stock market to national policy. Their actions weren't just about business, they were about controlling an entire nation. And they did it with a calculated coldness, always thinking one step ahead, while the rest of the country remained blissfully unaware of the forces controlling their lives. But despite all their wealth and control, these families were far from untouchable. As their power grew, so did the number of people who began to question the means by which they achieved it. And yet, the dark roots of their legacy remained hidden, tucked away behind lavish estates, private clubs, and the polished, respectable image they cultivated for the public. But those roots would come to the surface in the coming years as scandals began to rock the foundations of these dynasties. Beneath the surface of wealth, privilege, and respectability, the skeletons of past sins rattled, hidden behind a curtain of secrecy, guarded by wealth, influence, and carefully crafted public images. It begs the question, how much does the past shape the present? What happens when the secrets of the past come to light, threatening to unravel the very fabric of the families who built empires on lies and deceit? And more importantly, what are these families willing to do to ensure that their secrets stay buried? As we continue, we'll uncover more about how these dark bloodlines didn't just influence the past, they shaped the future of America. And in some cases, their legacy still holds power to this day. Chapter 2: The First Sins, Colonial Beginnings. If we want to understand the deep, twisted roots of America's wealthiest families, we have to go all the way back, way before the robber barons or the Wall Street moguls. We need to look at the very first generations of settlers, colonists, and landowners who helped shape the nation's foundations. And in doing so, we uncover some of the darkest, most uncomfortable truths about how America's wealth was built. It's easy to romanticize the early days of America, the idea of brave settlers forging new lives in a vast, untamed land. But what's often left out of the story is how those settlers profited, not just through hard work, but through the exploitation of others. Whether it was the brutal enslavement of African people, the systematic extermination of indigenous populations, or the cutthroat tactics used to seize land, the origins of American wealth are anything but pure. At the heart of the colonial economy was slavery. The colonies, particularly in the South, were built on the backs of enslaved African men, women, and children. These families, who would go on to become America's early elites, were the ones who took ownership of the plantations and inherited vast swaths of land. And it's no accident that these families would go on to build empires of unimaginable wealth. But that wealth didn't come easily, it was blood-soaked. The wealth generated from plantations wasn't just a local affair, it was international. Colonial America thrived on a global economy, and a massive portion of its riches was tied to the transatlantic slave trade. The people who owned these plantations, many of whom would later go on to be some of the most powerful and respected names in American society, relied on the forced labor of African slaves. This gruesome cycle of exploitation became the backbone of the country's economic success. Names like the Lees, the Randolphs, and the Carters became synonymous with power in Virginia and beyond. They were part of the so-called First Families of Virginia, a group that controlled vast estates, wielded political influence, and accumulated staggering amounts of wealth. But their prosperity was built on the backs of others. These families' fortunes were rooted in the sale of human lives, a truth that would be buried, swept under the rug as the generations passed. But the story of these families doesn't end with slavery. With the rise of new industries came new ways to hold on to that power. The early American elite knew that controlling land wasn't enough. They needed to control something even more valuable: people. So they began using their wealth to shape political systems, to craft laws and policies that would ensure their grip on the nation would never loosen. Through strategic marriages, political alliances, and shrewd investments, they secured their place in the nation's future. As the colonies expanded and the new nation took shape, these same families continued to exert their influence. They understood the power of control, not just over land, but over the very systems that governed the country. It was during this period that many of America's most enduring power structures were born, and the wealthiest families of the time did everything they could to secure their places at the top. Take, for instance, the Founding Fathers. Many of them were part of these same elite bloodlines that had thrived off the horrors of colonialism. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison, to name a few, had bloodlines that were deeply tied to the land that had been built with the labor of enslaved Africans. Their wealth, power, and status weren't simply a result of their political acumen. they were deeply connected to the very systems that kept the wealthy in control and the oppressed in chains. It was in the early 1800s that these families began to solidify their influence in ways that would leave a lasting impact on the country. While many of the founding fathers were busy drafting documents like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, their personal fortunes were being secured through land grants, political maneuvering, and most chilling of all, slavery. These families were far from the idealistic figures we've been taught to revere. Their actions shaped a nation, but they did so with the full knowledge that their success came at a horrific cost. And so, with each passing generation, these colonial families solidified their hold on America. The same bloodlines that had been built on violence and exploitation during the colonial period were now intricately tied to the nation's political and economic systems. The wealth these families had amassed became entrenched, passed down through the generations, and carefully protected by the very structures that had been designed to uphold their dominance. What's fascinating and deeply troubling is how these families used their inherited power to shape not just the physical landscape of America, but its very identity. The American dream, as we know it today, has often been romanticized as a tale of self-made men and women, rising through grit and determination. But for a certain class of people, the reality was much more cynical. They weren't climbing the ladder, they were standing at the top looking down, ensuring that no one else could climb as high. By the time the Civil War erupted, the divide between the wealthy elites who controlled the South and the enslaved populations they relied on had reached a boiling point. The plantation economy and its wealth were now a symbol of everything that was wrong with America. Yet, even in the midst of this turmoil, the families who had built their fortunes on slavery and exploitation continued to pull the strings from behind the scenes. The war, though it may have been a turning point for the country as a whole, was yet another chapter in the continuing saga of these dark bloodlines, families who would go on to shape the history of America in ways that still echo today. Chapter 3: Twisted Power, the Founding Families. The early days of America were marked by the rise of some truly remarkable individuals, men and women who, through vision, ambition, and sheer force of will, shaped the very fabric of the new nation. But as we dig deeper into the history of the wealthiest and most influential families of the time, we begin to see something darker lurking beneath the surface. The Founding Fathers, the people we've been taught to revere as symbols of democracy and liberty, were also deeply entangled in a web of privilege, exploitation, and manipulation. And the same families that helped lay the foundations of the United States also helped establish the unequal power dynamics that persist to this day. Take a moment and think about the so-called Founding Fathers. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin. These names are synonymous with the American Revolution, the fight for independence, and the birth of a nation. But behind their public personas, the reality is far more complicated. These men, while advocating for liberty and freedom, were also the beneficiaries of systems that kept others enslaved, subjugated, and oppressed. Let's start with George Washington. He was a man of power and wealth who helped lead the country toward independence. But what's often glossed over in the history books is the fact that Washington, like many of the Founding Fathers, was a slave owner. His plantation was built on the backs of enslaved Africans who worked the land that allowed him to accumulate his wealth. In fact, Washington was one of the wealthiest men in America, largely due to the labor of enslaved people. His personal contradiction, the man who fought for liberty but who was deeply complicit in the institution of slavery, was not unique. It was part of the system that allowed these families to thrive. Now let's look at Thomas Jefferson, another name that's etched into the history of the United States. Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, famously wrote that all men are created equal. But Jefferson's personal life tells a much darker story. He too was a slave owner. His Monticello estate, where he resided for most of his life, was built and maintained by enslaved African Americans. He was not just a founding father, he was a man who benefited from a system of forced labor. Perhaps most disturbingly, Jefferson's complex relationship with slavery is tied to his own personal contradictions. He had children with one of his enslaved women, Sally Hemings, a woman he owned, and their descendants were kept in the shadows of history for years. Jefferson, like so many of the founding elites, managed to reconcile his public advocacy for freedom and equality with his private life, built on oppression. These examples are not isolated. They are part of a larger pattern of founding families whose wealth and power were built upon systems that violently excluded others. Even Benjamin Franklin, often seen as the universal man, was a slave owner, and while he later became an advocate for abolition, his earlier wealth was tied to the same economy that sustained slavery. The truth is that the American Revolution, which is often portrayed as a battle for liberty, was also a battle for power, and a battle that the wealthy elite was always poised to win. These founding families used their influence not just to shape the new government, but to create a system that would maintain their power, wealth, and control over generations to come. As the nation moved forward and the Constitution was ratified, these families had already ensured their place at the top of the social hierarchy. Their names were now written into the very documents that would define the future of America. But this was more than just political power. It was a power built on deep economic influence and the strategic manipulation of the systems they had helped create. One of the most chilling aspects of these families' rise is how they maintained their dominance over the years. Even as America grew and evolved, they continued to secure their wealth and influence, ensuring that the status quo would be upheld for generations. Their methods, though often subtle, were as effective as they were ruthless. Take, for example, the way these families maintained their control through land ownership. The acquisition of vast land holdings, often through questionable means, was a key strategy in establishing long-term power. With land came wealth, and with wealth came political influence. The wealthiest families used this advantage to build political dynasties, creating a network of influence that spanned the halls of Congress and the Oval Office. Their power was hidden in plain sight, operating behind closed doors and through subtle manipulations that most people never saw. But the most unsettling part of their legacy is how these early power players set the stage for the continuing inequality in America. By concentrating wealth and land in the hands of a select few, they created a system that would persistently favor the elites well into the 21st century. The structures that were set in place during these formative years continue to shape the distribution of wealth and power today. The founding families, many of whom had bloodlines tied to slavery, war, and exploitation, became the template for the nation's future aristocracy. They laid the foundation for a society in which a small group of wealthy families would continue to hold the reins of power, often at the expense of the larger population. This cycle of privilege and exploitation has echoed through the generations, and its effects are still felt today. Chapter 4: The Underworld Connections. The story of America's wealthiest families is often told through the lens of business, politics, and industry. But what if I told you there's an undercurrent to this story, a darker side that's usually kept hidden in the shadows? These families didn't just amass wealth through legitimate means. They were also connected to the criminal underworld, to illicit activities that helped cement their power and influence. The ties between the elite and organized crime in America are more intertwined than most people realize. Many of the most powerful families in the country didn't just benefit from their legitimate business ventures, they also profited from crime, corruption, and shady dealings. This connection to the underworld was often veiled behind legitimate business practices, but the truth is, it's always been there, lurking just beneath the surface. As the Industrial Revolution swept through America, it brought with it not just technological advancement, but also a wave of corruption and crime. The rising power of the country's elites was paralleled by the rise of powerful criminal syndicates that operated in cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. And as we will see, many of the most powerful families in America weren't just businessmen, they were also deeply connected to these criminal enterprises. It's a story that has often been overlooked, but it's one that reveals how the lines between legitimate power and criminality are often blurrier than we care to admit. For many of America's wealthiest families, their success didn't come solely from clean business deals. It came from strategic alliances with mobsters, racketeers, and corrupt politicians who helped grease the wheels of their empire building. One of the most notorious examples of this connection between America's elite and organized crime can be seen in the rise of the mafia in the early 20th century. While many of the country's wealthiest families were busy growing their fortunes through industries like banking, oil, and railroads, the mafia was establishing its own foothold, particularly in the big cities. The mobs controlled everything from the local rackets to international operations, and the families who ran these criminal empires had an uncanny ability to form lucrative relationships with the political and business elite. Take New York City in the early 1900s. The rise of figures like Charles "Lucky" Luciano, Mayor Lansky, and Vito Genovese marked the mafia's ascendancy to power. But these men weren't operating in isolation. They were working hand-in-hand with some of the most powerful families in the city. Real estate moguls, bankers, and even politicians were making deals with the mob, often turning a blind eye to the more violent aspects of their operations in exchange for money, favors, and influence. The Gambino family, for example, became one of the most powerful criminal syndicates in America. The family's influence didn't stop at the streets of New York. By the mid-20th century, they had forged connections with some of the wealthiest individuals in the country. Their ties to politicians, law enforcement, and even Hollywood gave them a level of protection that allowed them to operate with impunity. But the connection between crime and high society wasn't limited to the mafia. Other organized criminal syndicates also had their hand in the cookie jar. and the wealthiest families in America knew how to use these connections to maintain and grow their power. From gambling operations to bootlegging during Prohibition, these families were all too happy to look the other way as criminal activity funded their businesses. The intertwining of criminal enterprises with America's elite wasn't just confined to the mafia's heyday. Even as the mafia's influence began to wane in the latter half of the 20th century, the connections between wealth, power, and crime remained just as strong, albeit more discreet. For many of America's wealthiest families, the moral lines were always blurred, and the legacy of criminal dealings carried on through generations. Take, for example, the way political corruption often enabled these families to maintain their hold over power. Through the 20th century, powerful families didn't just rely on legitimate business practices to sustain their wealth, they also relied on connections in high places. Politicians who were willing to turn a blind eye, law enforcement who could be bought, and judges who could be manipulated, made sure that the criminal ties these families had cultivated would remain secure. The very systems that were supposed to hold the powerful accountable were often working to protect them. In fact, some of the most influential families in America are still closely tied to organized crime, albeit in more subtle ways. While the mafia may no longer control the streets the way they once did, their legacy endures in the form of money laundering schemes, underground casinos, and corrupt dealings that continue to shape the nation's wealth and power dynamics. These connections, though now more hidden, continue to benefit the very families who have been linked to them for generations. So, as we move forward, the question becomes, how deep do these connections really run, and what's the real cost of these alliances? Who pays the price when families continue to profit from both the legitimate and the criminal? Chapter 5: Blood Money, the Corruption of Wealth. In the previous chapters, we've uncovered the twisted foundations upon which America's wealthiest families were built, foundations laced with violence, exploitation, and criminal connections. But the story doesn't end there. As the country progressed through the 19th and 20th centuries, these families began to solidify their wealth and influence in ways that were even more calculated, more strategic, and perhaps most chillingly, more hidden from the public eye. The wealth that so many of America's richest families have amassed was not simply the result of good business practices, innovative entrepreneurship, or self-made success. No, it came from the exploitation of systems designed to benefit the few at the expense of the many. These families, whether they realized it or not, were beneficiaries of something much more sinister than luck. They were beneficiaries of corruption, systemic inequality, and political manipulation. Take the Industrial Revolution, for example. It was a time of immense growth and opportunity in America, but it was also a time of incredible greed. The rise of tycoons like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan marks a period of rapid wealth accumulation that in many ways was fueled by corruption and exploitation. These men didn't just rise to prominence through their business acumen, they thrived because they were willing to play by a different set of rules. While America's workers were toiling away in dangerous factories, earning pennies for their labor, the wealthiest families were consolidating their control over entire industries. They did this by forming monopolies that crushed competition, stifled innovation, and kept wages low for the working class. By controlling every aspect of their industries, from production to transportation to distribution, they were able to dictate the terms of labor, ensuring that their workers would remain subjugated while their profits soared. But the monopolies these families created were not just about market control, they were about political influence. The wealth generated by these monopolies allowed the elites to cement their power over the political systems that were supposed to regulate them. These families didn't just rely on their businesses to maintain their dominance, they also relied on politicians who would do their bidding. In fact, some of the wealthiest families in America during the Gilded Age were deeply intertwined with the political machinery of the time. Rockefeller, Carnegie, and others didn't just build empires, they helped shape the very laws that allowed them to thrive. They used their immense wealth to influence elections, buy off politicians, and secure favorable legislation that kept their monopolies intact. This was a time when politics and business were often one and the same, and those in power played a game where the rules were rigged in favor of the elite. For example, during the early years of the railroad industry, J.P. Morgan was able to consolidate several railroad companies under his control. He didn't do this through fair competition or innovation. Instead, he used his political connections and wealth to outmaneuver competitors and take over the industry. The result? A railroad monopoly that effectively controlled how goods and people moved across the country. And it wasn't just the railroads. The steel industry, under Andrew Carnegie's influence, saw similar tactics, undercutting competitors, exploiting labor, and ensuring that workers had little to no power in negotiating for better wages or working conditions. Carnegie's wealth was built on the backs of thousands of men and women who worked long hours in dangerous conditions for a fraction of what they produced. As these families amassed unimaginable wealth, the impact on the broader society was profound. While a select few enjoyed opulent lifestyles, the majority of Americans were living in poverty, struggling to make ends meet. The working conditions in factories and mines were horrendous, child labor was rampant, and the gap between the wealthy elite and the working class grew wider than ever. The Industrial Revolution, which should have been a time of progress and innovation for all, instead became a gilded age for the few, built on the suffering of the many. But what makes this period even more unsettling is how the wealth generated by such corruption continues to shape the landscape of modern America. Systems that these families helped create, systems built on exploitation and manipulation, still exist today. The monopolies that were formed during the Gilded Age were broken up, but the political and economic influence of these families didn't disappear. Instead, it evolved, becoming even more entrenched in the fabric of American society. Today, many of the wealthiest families in America continue to control industries, media empires, and even entire political parties. Their influence can be seen in everything from the pharmaceutical industry to the tech giants of Silicon Valley. The same tactics of monopolization, exploitation, and corruption that built their fortunes in the 19th century are still in play today, albeit in more sophisticated forms. And while the world has changed in many ways, the underlying principles that allowed these families to thrive, the exploitation of the many for the benefit of the few, are still very much alive. The corrupting influence of money on politics, the manipulation of public opinion through media, and the control of essential industries by a select group of people are all part of a legacy that stretches back to these earliest power players. Chapter 6: The Dark Generations, Bloodlines in Conflict. By now, we've traced the origins of America's most powerful families, their roots tangled in corruption, slavery, and bloodshed. But what happens when power is inherited? When wealth, influence, and a legacy of dark secrets are passed down through generations, what does that do to the next in line? The story doesn't end with the founders or even the robber barons of the Gilded Age. The next generations of these families were just as influential, but they faced a new challenge: how to maintain control over vast empires that were built on a foundation of blood, power, and deceit. Imagine being born into a legacy where everything you have, the wealth, the status, the influence, was built on the suffering of others. What kind of pressure would that create? What kind of person would you become knowing that the very air you breathe was tainted by the sins of your forefathers? The answer for many of these heirs was often a complex mix of guilt, power, and a desperate need to uphold the family legacy at all costs. The dark bloodlines that shaped America's elite didn't just pass on their wealth, they passed on their burdens. These families had a lot to live up to, and they often had to do whatever it took to maintain their grip on power. This meant making alliances with other powerful families, using manipulation and deceit, and at times, resorting to violence to protect their interests. One of the most striking aspects of these generational stories is the tension between maintaining the family's image of respectability and dealing with the reality of their past. As these families entered the 20th century, they found themselves caught between their inherited wealth and the growing pressure from the public and the media to distance themselves from the criminal origins that had once been their bedrock. The pressures of maintaining a clean image were never more pronounced than during the early to mid-20th century, when the influence of the media began to reach its peak. The old hidden alliances, those with organized crime, political corruption, and business manipulation, were suddenly at risk of being exposed to the public. For the first time, these families had to deal with the consequences of their legacy in a more visible way. Consider the example of the Kennedys, a family that rose to prominence during this era. While they cultivated an image of American idealism and public service, their rise to power was tied to more than just political savvy. The Kennedy family fortune was rooted in bootlegging during Prohibition, with patriarch Joseph P. Kennedy making his fortune in a legal alcohol trade. Yet, despite this criminal origin, the family quickly shed its illicit past in favor of an image built on patriotism, wealth, and respectability. The transition wasn't easy, and it was far from perfect. Family members, particularly John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy, were forced to navigate the difficult path of balancing their public service with the shadow of their family's past. In some cases, the weight of their ancestors' choices seemed to haunt them, driving them to succeed at all costs, but also sometimes leading them to tragic ends. But the Kennedys were not alone. This conflict between legacy and public image was a struggle that every powerful family had to face. The DuPonts, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, each of these dynasties was forced to wrestle with the question: how do you hold on to power when your family's foundation is built on corruption, greed, and moral ambiguity? The answer, for many of them, was to keep the family business running smoothly no matter the cost, and to present a front of respectability to the public. However, maintaining that front of respectability wasn't always possible, and as the years passed, cracks began to appear in the carefully curated images of these families. The generational conflict within these bloodlines grew more pronounced. As the heirs of these powerful families stepped into the spotlight, they found themselves caught between honoring their forebears' legacies and dealing with the growing awareness that their fortunes were built on deeply troubling foundations. Take, for instance, the example of the Rockefellers, one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in America's history. John D. Rockefeller had built his empire on oil, using ruthless tactics to establish a monopoly that crushed competitors and manipulated markets. By the time his heirs took control, the family had become a symbol of both wealth and philanthropy. But even as the Rockefellers donated millions to causes like education and public health, the shadow of their patriarch's methods loomed large. John D's successors struggled to reconcile the family's public image with the dark origins of their fortune. The Rockefeller name became synonymous with both generosity and greed, philanthropy and exploitation. The internal conflict within the family was palpable. While some descendants took on philanthropic roles, advocating for social change and environmental causes, others remained deeply entrenched in the world of business, unable or unwilling to separate themselves from the wealth built on the backs of exploited workers and monopolistic practices. This generational struggle is a recurring theme among the wealthiest families in America. How do you live with the weight of your family's past? How do you carry forward a legacy that's steeped in darkness while trying to create a positive impact on the world? For many, the answer has been to keep their heads down, to distance themselves from the unsavory origins of their wealth, and to focus on maintaining the family name and power. But the truth is, no matter how hard they try to distance themselves from their ancestors' sins, the bloodlines they inherit still carry the weight of those actions. The choices made by one generation ripple through the next, shaping the lives of those who follow, whether they like it or not. Chapter 7: The Hidden Scandals, Secrets of America's Elite. If we take a closer look at the wealthiest families in America, we see that their legacies are often not as spotless as they would like us to believe. Behind the grand estates, the polished public images, and the carefully crafted narratives of success lies a far darker truth. For every family that claims to have built its fortune through hard work and determination, there are secrets buried deep beneath the surface, scandals that have been hidden away for generations. What happens when the skeletons in the closet aren't just metaphorical but real? What happens when the dark history of a family's wealth can no longer be ignored or swept under the rug? These hidden scandals are the underbelly of American power. And while they're often obscured by the media or whitewashed by generations of public relations, they're very real and very dangerous. Throughout American history, the wealthiest families have been adept at keeping their scandals under wraps, using their power and influence to control the narrative. It's not that these scandals don't exist, they do, but they are often hidden behind a carefully constructed facade of respectability. This was particularly true during the early 20th century, when America's elites were masters at keeping their personal lives out of the public eye. But as time has gone on, the truth about these families has started to leak out, revealing the corruption, the deceit, and the immorality that sustained their empires. One of the most shocking examples of this hidden world of scandals can be found in the world of old money. Take the Astors, for example, one of the wealthiest and most powerful families of the 19th century. While they were known for their grand mansions and social connections, their wealth was built on exploitation, specifically through land deals that pushed indigenous people off their land. Their fortune also had ties to slavery, with their plantation holdings contributing to their vast wealth. But even more unsettling are the scandals that plagued the family's later generations, particularly in the form of publicized affairs, tragic deaths, and rumors of corruption within their businesses. But the Astors weren't alone in their hidden scandals. The Rockefellers, whose name has long been associated with both immense wealth and philanthropy, also have a darker side to their legacy. John D. Rockefeller's fortune, built through the monopolization of the oil industry, was not just about business acumen. It was about ruthless practices that crushed competition and exploited workers. As the family grew into one of the wealthiest dynasties in history, the scandals began to pile up, especially in the form of labor disputes, exploitation, and violent tactics used to silence any opposition. In fact, the Rockefeller family's wealth came at the cost of many lives. Workers in their oil refineries faced grueling conditions with no regard for their safety or well-being. When labor strikes broke out in the early 20th century, the Rockefellers resorted to violence and coercion to break them. The Ludlow Massacre in 1914, where striking coal miners and their families were killed by the Colorado National Guard at the request of Rockefeller's company, remains one of the most horrific chapters in the family's legacy. Despite these scandals, the Rockefeller family managed to maintain an image of respectability. Through philanthropy, they created institutions like the Rockefeller Foundation, which funded educational and medical initiatives. Yet the philanthropic facade couldn't erase the bloodstains left by their rise to power. This duality of public benevolence and private brutality has been a consistent theme in the legacies of many of America's elite families. But the secretive nature of these families didn't stop there. The Vanderbilts, another iconic American family, also had their own set of hidden scandals. Though they were known for their lavish lifestyles and grand mansions, much of their fortune came from the exploitation of the working class during the railroad boom. Cornelius Vanderbilt, who amassed a vast fortune in railroads and shipping, was notorious for his cutthroat business practices. He was known for manipulating stock prices, exploiting workers, and using political influence to solidify his position. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of these families' hidden scandals is how these dark truths continue to be swept under the rug, even in the modern era. Many of these families have managed to preserve their reputations through strategic media control, philanthropic efforts, and the careful manipulation of public perception. They've built empires not just on wealth, but on their ability to curate their image and erase any trace of scandal. Take the case of the Bush family, for example. While George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush are often remembered for their political careers, there's a long history of scandal within their bloodline. Prescott Bush, George W. Bush's grandfather, was involved in business dealings with Nazi Germany during World War II, including financial ties to companies that were supplying materials to the regime. These connections, however, were rarely discussed during the Bush family's rise to political prominence. Instead, they were kept hidden, safely tucked away in the shadows. The story of the Bush family is a prime example of how America's elite families have managed to bury uncomfortable truths in order to protect their legacies. Just as the Kennedy family carefully managed its public image despite its criminal origins, the Bush family, too, strategically distanced itself from any trace of scandal or corruption in its past. And it's not just politicians who benefit from this selective amnesia. Hollywood elites, too, have their skeletons. The wealth and influence of Hollywood dynasties like the Kennedys or the Hearsts were often built on scandals that have been carefully hidden behind the glossy veneer of celebrity culture. The fame, wealth, and privilege of these families often mask their involvement in shady dealings, extramarital affairs, and corrupt practices that have been kept hidden from the public eye for decades. Chapter 8: The Sins of the Fathers. What happens when the sins of the past refuse to stay buried? When the actions of one generation continue to haunt the lives of those who come after them? The bloodlines of America's most powerful families are marred by dark histories that can't easily be erased no matter how much wealth or influence is involved. As we've seen, these families didn't just inherit wealth, they inherited a burden. A legacy of oppression, violence, and exploitation that's passed down like a heavy chain, shackling future generations to the sins of their ancestors. But here's the question: how does one reconcile with a past that's steeped in bloodshed? How does the next generation deal with the fact that their wealth was built on the suffering of others? In many cases, they don't. Instead, they double down on their family's power and legacy, perpetuating the cycle of secrecy, manipulation, and greed. The conflict between maintaining family honor and dealing with the moral consequences of their ancestors' actions is a story that repeats itself across these dark bloodlines. Take the DuPonts, for example. Known for their chemical empire, the DuPont family has a legacy that spans centuries. Their wealth, once built on the back of a monopoly in explosives and chemicals, was passed down through the generations with an ever-growing influence in American society. But beneath the wealth and success, there's a darker side to the DuPonts, one that was forged in secrecy, scandal, and moral ambiguity. In the 20th century, scandals involving the DuPont family became public, and yet the family name continued to thrive. The most infamous of these scandals involved the trial of family member John DuPont, who was convicted of murdering Olympic wrestler Dave Schultz. The case shocked the nation, but it wasn't just the murder that revealed the DuPonts' dark side. The family had long been entangled in a web of privilege, wealth, and manipulation, often using their influence to avoid the consequences of their actions. The DuPont family is far from an isolated example. Many of America's wealthiest bloodlines share this pattern of inherited sin, their fortunes steeped in exploitation and violence, yet their public images polished to perfection. The Rockefellers, for instance, have long struggled with reconciling their philanthropic image with their monopolistic beginnings. John D. Rockefeller, while being lauded for his charitable donations, was also the architect of some of the most cutthroat and exploitative business practices in American history. His wealth came from crushing competition and undermining fair market practices, yet his descendants have used his charitable donations to create an image of a benevolent family. As generations pass, the guilt of inheriting such wealth does not disappear. Instead, it transforms into an unspoken pressure to both uphold the family name and to distance oneself from the less savory aspects of the family's past. This internal conflict plays out in various ways. Some descendants attempt to atone for their ancestors' sins through philanthropy or activism, while others, more committed to preserving the family's power, continue to perpetuate the same systems of exploitation and control that allowed the family to rise in the first place. For instance, many descendants of powerful families have worked to distance themselves from the more violent aspects of their past. The Kennedy family, despite its immense political legacy and ties to public service, is not immune to this struggle. While they may project an image of public service and moral leadership, the Kennedy family has long been tangled in scandals, including the infamous actions of Patriarch Joseph P. Kennedy, whose ties to the mob during Prohibition shaped much of the family's wealth. His children, particularly John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy, worked tirelessly to maintain the family's reputation, despite their father's controversial past. The question remains, can a family ever truly escape the sins of their fathers? Can descendants ever wash their hands of the wrongdoings that built their empires? Or are they doomed to carry the weight of their ancestors' actions, no matter how much they try to separate themselves from it? As these families continue to navigate the burdens of their past, some members of the next generations find themselves caught in a moral tug-of-war. The pressure to either uphold the family's wealth and legacy or to reject it and seek redemption is often overwhelming. For many, the idea of rejecting their inheritance, financially, politically, and socially, is nearly impossible. The wealth, the connections, the power, it's all tied up in a legacy that cannot be ignored. But for others, there comes a breaking point. Take, for instance, the story of some of the heirs who chose to publicly distance themselves from their family's businesses. The Rockefeller descendants, while still wealthy, became known for their philanthropic efforts and personal struggles with the legacy of their ancestors. Some have openly grappled with the shame of their wealth, choosing to use their fortune for causes that seek to repair the damage done by their forefathers, even as they remain entangled in the power structures their ancestors built. But can a few charitable donations undo the years of exploitation and corruption that built their fortune? The DuPonts, despite the publicized scandals, continue to hold on to their wealth and influence. But the tragedy of John DuPont's criminal actions forced the family to confront the reality of their legacy in a way that no public relations effort could cover up. The weight of their bloodline became too heavy for some, yet many in the family opted to continue living behind the comfort of their inherited wealth, trying to bury the shame rather than confront it. For the families who chose to confront their past, it was never a simple task. The ghosts of their ancestors' sins remained, looming over their actions, sometimes driving them toward self-doubt and regret. Yet they were still inheritors of immense power and influence, and even with the best of intentions, the shadow of their past often shaped their futures in ways they couldn't escape. The deeper truth is that for these families, the sins of the fathers are never easily shaken off. The wealth, the power, and the moral contradictions become part of their bloodline, passed down like a heavy inheritance, one that many of them may never fully come to terms with. Chapter 9: Dark Alliances, Families that Shaped History. Throughout the history of America, certain families have not only amassed unimaginable wealth, they've also played pivotal roles in shaping the country's political and economic landscape. The influence of these families extends far beyond their business ventures and inherited power. They've had a direct hand in crafting the nation's laws, policies, and international dealings. But with such power comes the inevitable question: what price is paid for these alliances? What happens when families, whose fortunes have been built on exploitation and manipulation, use their influence to shape the very fabric of the country? In many cases, these dark alliances are often forged behind closed doors, through shady business dealings, political maneuvering, and covert support for the most influential figures in American history. From the very beginning, these families have worked tirelessly to make sure their interests, no matter how sinister, are protected and advanced. Let's take a look at the powerful connection between the Morgans and the political elite. J.P. Morgan was not just a financier, he was one of the most influential men in the world during his time. Through his bank, Morgan controlled vast swaths of America's economy. His influence stretched into nearly every major industry: railroads, steel, and even the government itself. Morgan didn't just lend money, he dictated national policy. During the Panic of 1907, he single-handedly orchestrated a financial rescue, using his immense wealth to stabilize the country's collapsing financial system. But his motivations were never altruistic. He knew that in return for saving the country from disaster, he could solidify his grip on the American economy for years to come. The Morgans, like many of these powerful families, used their wealth and influence not just to build empires, but to control the very systems that made their wealth possible. Through political alliances, financial manipulations, and outright bribery, the Morgans ensured that their interests were always protected, even at the cost of the American public. In the process, they built a dynasty that would leave a lasting legacy on both Wall Street and the halls of power in Washington, D.C. But the Morgans weren't the only family to forge such powerful alliances. The Rockefellers, too, wielded tremendous influence not only in business but in shaping national policy. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil empire wasn't just a business, it was a political force. His company controlled nearly 90% of the U.S. oil industry at its peak, and with that power came the ability to influence politicians, shape laws, and even sway public opinion. In the early 20th century, the Rockefeller family became key players in the world of politics. Through strategic donations, backdoor deals, and lobbying, they managed to maintain their dominance in the oil industry while also ensuring their protection from government intervention. The family's deep ties to the Republican Party helped them avoid regulatory scrutiny for decades, allowing them to continue their monopolistic practices. Even as public outcry against monopolies grew, the Rockefellers were able to use their wealth and political connections to sidestep much of the backlash. In many ways, the Rockefeller family's power was a microcosm of how America's wealthiest families used their influence to shape the political landscape. Behind every major political decision, there were dark alliances being forged, alliances that were rooted in money, power, and control. For the elite families, it wasn't just about accumulating wealth. It was about ensuring that their wealth was protected by the very laws and systems that should have regulated them. Even as America grew into a global power, the connections between the nation's richest families and political elites continued to solidify. These alliances weren't limited to American shores. They extended into international business dealings, creating a network of influence that spanned the globe. The Bush family, for instance, has long been associated with both oil and politics. Prescott Bush, the patriarch, was not only a powerful businessman but also deeply connected to the political elite of his time. His ties to Wall Street and international banking set the stage for the family's rise to power, culminating in the presidencies of his son, George H.W. Bush, and grandson, George W. Bush. The Bush family's connections to global power are a prime example of how these dark alliances continue to shape American politics. Prescott Bush's financial dealings were not confined to the United States. They extended to Nazi Germany during World War II, where he was involved in business with firms that were later accused of aiding the Nazi regime. This shadowy connection was largely kept under wraps, but it speaks to the larger theme that these powerful families often operate in the background, pulling strings and making deals that secure their position in the world. As the 20th century progressed, these families began to realize that their influence didn't just extend through political alliances or business monopolies. They also began shaping global events, often in ways that benefited their financial and political interests. The Bush family's rise to power, particularly through the oil industry, shows how these families didn't just control America, they played a role in shaping international geopolitics. The decision-making processes that led to wars, the manipulation of oil prices, and the creation of foreign policy strategies were often dictated by the interests of the wealthiest and most powerful families. These alliances aren't always as overt as the Bushes or the Rockefellers. Sometimes they manifest in more subtle ways through international banking, media empires, and corporate consolidation. Yet the underlying principle remains the same. Wealth and power remain in the hands of the few, and their influence extends far beyond the borders of their own country. These families shape history not just with the wealth they amass, but with the strategic relationships they form and the political power they wield, both at home and abroad. The true cost of these alliances is difficult to measure. While these families may have secured their own prosperity, they've often done so at the expense of the American public, and in some cases, the world at large. The powerful elite have always been able to navigate the complexities of global politics, economics, and power structures to ensure that their fortunes and their influence remain intact, no matter the cost to those beneath them. Chapter 10: The Legacy of Darkness. As we approach the end of this journey through America's darkest bloodlines, one question lingers: what has become of these families today? In the 21st century, where the power of old money seems to be increasingly overshadowed by the new, where do the descendants of these infamous families stand? Have they left their dark legacies behind, or are they still carrying the weight of their ancestors' sins, hidden in plain sight beneath a polished veneer of respectability? The truth is, the legacy of these dark bloodlines is far from over. While some families may have distanced themselves from the criminal origins of their wealth, the foundations they built, on corruption, exploitation, and ruthless manipulation, continue to hold sway over American society. The connections these families forged, the alliances they cultivated, and the power they consolidated have persisted, shaping everything from the country's economy to its politics and even its cultural fabric. Let's start by looking at how these families continue to influence the present day. The Rockefeller family, for example, remains one of the wealthiest and most influential families in America, despite their philanthropic efforts. While the Rockefellers are often praised for their charitable contributions, particularly through the Rockefeller Foundation, the family's business dealings and influence over American industry cannot be ignored. Their legacy still looms large, not only in the oil industry but in sectors like education, healthcare, and even environmental conservation. Similarly, the Kennedy family, while publicly celebrated for their political contributions and commitment to public service, still carries the weight of their family's dark past. The family's wealth, which was initially built on bootlegging during Prohibition, has been strategically concealed, and many of their more unsavory dealings have been left out of the narrative that the Kennedys have so carefully crafted over the years. But despite their attempts at reinventing themselves, the shadows of their history continue to follow them. But it's not just the Rockefellers and the Kennedys who continue to shape the present. Other old money families like the DuPonts, the Morgans, and the Vanderbilts have also remained deeply embedded in the structures of power in America. Many of these families have diversified their fortunes into a wide array of industries, from pharmaceuticals to technology, ensuring that their wealth continues to grow, albeit in ways that are less visible to the public eye. Their influence is still felt in the highest echelons of power, whether it's through lobbying efforts, political contributions, or private investments that shape the future of American industry. The DuPont family, while no longer at the forefront of the chemical industry, has continued to be a major player in the world of corporate America, with descendants holding influential positions in business, finance, and even politics. Their legacy, tainted by scandals like the murder of Olympic wrestler Dave Schultz by family member John DuPont, is still a part of the family's story, one that continues to be swept under the rug by those eager to protect the family name. What's more unsettling is how these families, who built their empires on morally dubious foundations, have managed to maintain their power despite the revelations of their dark pasts. The fact that they continue to hold such sway over American politics and business suggests that the systems they helped create remain intact. The old money still controls much of the wealth, and with it, the influence over policy, culture, and the future of the nation. While these families may have evolved and adapted to the changing times, their core strategies of maintaining dominance through political influence, business monopolies, and philanthropic efforts remain eerily unchanged. As we look to the future, the question becomes, will these bloodlines ever truly be held accountable for their pasts? The answer is complicated. Despite the growing awareness of the dark origins of many of America's wealthiest families, the systems that enabled their rise to power remain deeply entrenched. Political corruption, corporate monopolies, and systemic inequality continue to favor the elite. These families, whether intentionally or not, have built an America where their influence is still felt, often in ways that go unnoticed by the public. The enduring power of these families lies not just in their wealth, but in the networks of influence they've created through politics, business, and social connections. Their ability to shape the future, to control the narrative, and to protect their legacies is a testament to how deeply embedded they are in the very fabric of American society. And while there may be those within these families who try to distance themselves from the darker chapters of their history, the truth remains that their fortunes were built on systems that continue to harm the majority. In many ways, these bloodlines have become a symbol of America itself, both the land of opportunity and the land of exploitation. For every self-made success story, there's a dark legacy of inherited wealth, corruption, and power. These families are not just relics of the past, they are living proof of how the structures of privilege continue to shape the world today. They are a reminder that in America, the game has always been rigged in favor of the few. And so, as we close the book on these dark bloodlines, one thing is clear: the legacy of darkness continues to haunt America. The power and influence of these families may have shifted with the times, but their grip on the country has never truly loosened. For as long as the systems they helped create remain intact, so too will the shadow of their past, a shadow that still looms over the present and will continue to shape the future.